Good evening, everybody. Hello. My name is Jörg Süßenbach. I'm the director of the Goethe Institute here in Boston. A warm welcome to all of you attending here at the Goethe Institute in Beacon Street, and a warm welcome to our guests online. We stream that on YouTube as well, so I guess there's some out wherever they are. Happy to say hello to you as well. This panel discussion is called How to Tax the Rich, which is an important and interesting topic. This is our second cooperation with the Thomas Mann House. It's the old residence of the famous German novelist Thomas Mann, living in Los Angeles during exile, and is a new residency, so-called, for fellows since 2018. And one of our guests, Felix Rohrbeck, is one of the actual fellows in Los Angeles at the Thomas Mann House. And when we realized that Felix is researching about this topic, how to tax the rich, what kind of criteria can we use to get the environmental aspect into that, we thought this could be an interesting topic because we have in Massachusetts the millionaire's tax since a while, and this seems to be in discussion and an important thing for Massachusetts as well. So we asked Felix whether he wants to come to Boston and join us for a panel discussion, and he said, yeah, he wants to talk to an expert. So we started to look for an expert, and it was not very hard to find even Horowitz, a specialist for these topics. He's let me say it correctly, the executive director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts University, and seems to be deeply linked to this topic, mainly because you're doing extensive research. That's what I found out. So we were suggesting even to Felix, and I think that was a good match. So thanks for that you came along now for tonight and discuss this topic afterwards. Felix is going to start the event with a little presentation. I think you said you have 5 theses, 5 topics you want to shortly highlight. It will last 10 to 15 minutes, and afterwards, Evan is joining the stage, and you're going to ask him a little bit, and I think that's a wonderful platform for further discussion. We're going to open that a little bit later for question and answers from the audience, from you, from the visitors. And then we're going to finalize that. I don't know how long it lasts, as long as it takes. If you want to join us later for a little reception, we have prepared a little bit of wine in the back room, and so if you feel like having some other words, maybe to the experts or in between, want to discuss the topic a little bit deeper, you're warmly invited to stay a little bit longer. Now, let me say thanks to the Thomas Mann House, especially to Benno Hertz for this wonderful cooperation, and to my dear colleagues Karin Oehlenschläger and Mattis Frickhöfer, who made this event possible. Let me finally mention that we have 2 other online events in March which could be interesting to you as well. The next one is in March 8th, when we have the choreographer Dana Casperson with us. She's going to present a new work from her, and at the 30th of March, we're going to have an event with Luisa Neubauer. She is a quite well-known activist for environmental topics in Germany, and she will talk to Sabine von Mering from the Brandeis University and others. 31st. Thank you for this correction. That's very important. So, to get started, let me introduce our 2 guests briefly. Don't worry, it will be short. Felix is a business journalist and has received many awards for his investigative research elaborate reporting and cross-media stories. Between 2014 and 2019, he edited the economics desk at Die Zeit, which is the largest weekly newspaper in Germany. In this capacity, he was involved in exposing the so-called Cum-Ex scandal, the biggest tax robbery in Europe, maybe in the whole century. You know that better, but I guess it is like that. Since 2020, Felix Rohrbeck is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the media startup Flip. Even Horowitz is, as mentioned before, the executive director of Tufts University's Center of State Policy Analysis. He had been a columnist for the Boston Globe, using data to tell stories about policy issues affecting Massachusetts and the nation as a whole, and contributed data-heavy stories for other medias as well. Even has worked at several Massachusetts think tanks, one focused on equitable economic outcomes and other dedicated to improving long-term thinking in capital markets. In the bygone past, Evan was professor of English literature with stints at Stanford, Harvard, Brandeis, Princeton, and the University of Texas. So once again, thanks for coming along, you, the audience, and you, our two guests. And please, the stage is yours, Felix.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. How to tax the rich? I think it's an important topic, but it can be also a delicate one. So the Thomas Mann House, where I'm staying at the moment in Los Angeles, is located in a very rich neighborhood in the Pacific Palisades. And last weekend, me and my fellows were invited to a party by the neighbors. And it was a fancy party, and there was really good wine, probably very expensive. It was a huge villa and a huge living room. I think there was enough space for probably 200 people. And you could see the infinity pool. And they were all really nice and interested in it. And of course, they asked me, okay, why are you here? What are you doing here? What is your topic? And I started, and I was saying, yeah, you know, it's about the rising inequality. And they agreed and said, yes, this is a very important topic. And then I continued and said, yeah, that's why I want to find out how we could tax the rich more heavily. And then the reaction was a bit more reserved, I would say. And yeah, but I think if we talk about the rising inequality and ways to fight it, we have to talk about taxes and how to tax the rich. And when I came here to the US, I was surprised how lively the debate here is, how many initiatives you have, how many ideas and even laws. And I think we have almost the same debate in Europe. And I think that is because we are faced by similar challenges. We know that too much inequality is bad for our societies. We know that people who live in very unequal countries are less healthy, less happy, they are stressed, and they are probably even less resistant to nationalism and populism. So I think there are good arguments to fight inequality, and to tax the rich is one of them. And I think it's not only about fighting inequality, it's also about the acceptance of our welfare states, because in many cases the richest pay hardly any taxes, and this is so unfair that people might start not to question only the tax system, but the whole system, so in the end our democracies, and that's not what we want. So how to tax the rich? I brought 5 theses I would like to share with you, and it won't take longer than 10 or 15 minutes, I hope. So my first thesis is don't eat the rich. And why am I saying that? The short answer is if you eat them, you can't tax them. But there's also a more serious answer. So if we look at series and movies, I think we can say that the rich are becoming a kind of pop culture villains of our time. So you have like series like The Riches of Amazon, or The White Lotus, or The Triangle of Sadness. And in these movies or series, the rich are described as, I would say, arrogant, greedy, moral, rotten people. And I don't know if this picture is true, but I would say it's okay for entertaining, but it doesn't help us in terms of politics. And sometimes even the opposite is the case. So, for example, after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, there was this narrative that a few greedy bankers messed it up. And I think that was quite unburdening for politicians, because they could point the finger to someone else and to channel the outrage to the moral fallover of some individuals. But what is the consequence? I mean, we can't make the bankers less greedy. So we can't change the rich, but we can change politics. And so I think don't eat the rich, tax the rich. Is a way to say it. My second thesis is seize the moment, because I think there is a window of opportunity at the moment. You can see the picture of Walter Scheidel. He is a history professor at Stanford, and he wrote a thick book about the history of inequality. And I think we can say that there is a bad news in it and there is a good news in it. And the bad news is that over a long time of period, the inequality was only reduced by big catastrophes. So, for example, wars or state collapse or pandemics. And of course, this is not what you want to reduce. But there's also a good news, and there's this quote from Walter Scheidel: the greater the shock to the system, the easier it becomes to reduce privilege at the top. And at the moment, I would say we have big shocks, big crises. So we had the Corona crisis, and during this crisis, the rich became even richer, while a lot of people were suffering. And we have the climate crisis, and the rich are responsible in particular. You can see that on the right chart. So if you belong to the top 1%, your average carbon footprint is 100 tons per year. The average footprint is only 6 tons per year. So the rich are in particular responsible. And so we have these two big crises and very good argument to make the rich pay more. But how to do it? I would say catch them where you can, because I think there's not one way to do it, there are many. So basically we have two different dimensions of inequality. We have the inequality in terms of income, and we have the inequality in terms of wealth. So we can see on the chart that the top 10% get 50% of the income, which is a lot. But they even own 80% of the wealth, which is even more. And if you look at Germany, the numbers are different, but the tendency is the same. Inequality in wealth is even higher than the inequality in terms. So if we look at the ways to tax the rich more heavily, I think we can try to arrange them to the degree they tax income or they tax wealth. So, for example, the Massachusetts millionaire tax is clearly an income tax, a pure income tax. Then we have Biden's proposal for a billionaire tax, which is pretty interesting because it's something in between. what Biden wants is a minimum tax for billionaires, a minimum income tax. And I think this is a good idea because at the moment they pay very often hardly anything, and he wants a minimum tax of 20%. But the problem is that there are very rich people like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg. And he's a billionaire, but he has almost no income. So he owns a company and a lot of stocks, but he doesn't pay a salary to himself and no dividends. So in the end, he has no income. He's poor in terms of income, and so he doesn't pay any taxes. And in this case, Biden's proposal says, okay, then we tax your unrealized capital gains. Sounds complicated, but it means, I make an example, if you are a tech founder and your stocks are worth $1 billion, and then the value even rises, and at the end of the year, it's $1.5 billion. So you are 500 million richer. So then Biden would say, okay, then we tax this 500 million by a tax of 20%. So it would be like $100 million. And so this is, and in the end, it's a kind of wealth tax then. So it's something, yeah, in between an income and a wealth tax. Then we have ideas of carbon luxury taxes. So the idea is if the rich are responsible for very high emissions, why not tax them for their emissions? Maybe we can talk about that later a little bit more. And then we have, of course, pure wealth taxes like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders have proposed. So in that case, you pay just, let's say, 1 or 2% of your total wealth annually. So technically, there are a lot of ways to tax the rich, but how to implement them? I would say one thing that really helps is to ask the people. Because if you ask them, they always say, yes, please let the rich pay more taxes. There's this survey done by the OECD, and they asked people in 21 countries. And in all 21 countries, there was a majority of people saying, yes, we want the rich to pay more. But politics can be, of course, much more complicated. So in Germany, for example, we have a coalition of 3 parties at the moment. We have the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals. And the Greens and the Social Democrats, they have 324 seats in the parliament, and they are both open for wealth taxes. But then we have the Liberals, and they have only 92 seats in the parliament. But they block every attempt to change the existing tax system because they are strongly representing the interests of their voters, which are the rich, wealthy people. So in the end, nothing happens. So what can help? I think that direct democracy can help. Have this ballot measures here in the US. That's exactly what happened here in Massachusetts. And we don't have them in Germany, but what we have are citizen councils, and they can only make recommendations, but still it's hard to ignore these recommendations completely. So I think direct democracy can help to really implement these kind of taxes. And this is something I learned here in the United States. You really need a good story to sell your idea. And I think there are 2 points which really help. And the first is to tax the very rich. So to concentrate, let's say, on the richest 1%, because then the middle class is not scared that in the end they could be hit by the tax. The other thing that is really helpful is if you can tell people what will happen with the money. And there are some interesting examples here in the US. So you can tax the very rich to help the homeless people. That's what Los Angeles did. They have a mansion tax. Or you can tax the very rich to fight climate change and its consequences. That was the idea of the Proposition 30 in California, which failed, but that had specific reasons, I think. Or you can tax the very rich to improve education and transportation. And that's, of course, the millionaire tax in Massachusetts. The bridge to start our little discussion. So far, and learn more about the Massachusetts. Thank you. Is it on? Yeah.
How about this one now? Yeah. That was great.
Thank you. I have brought a few questions.
I have to say, I should leave.
Shall I start with a question?
Sure.
For you?
I'm here.
Okay. Then let me start with a compliment, because I read the 2 reports you did on the millionaire tax. And louder? Okay. I read the 2 reports you did on the millionaire tax, and I was impressed because you digged very deeply, but you also presented these complicated facts in a very understandable and, I would say, objective way. And in Germany, I often hear that taxes are too complicated for people and that they can be manipulated very easily. So tax is something only for experts. So my first question is, would you say that the people here in Massachusetts had all the information they needed to make this decision?
That's a hard question to answer, in the sense that I think they had enough of the information that they needed to make this decision. I don't think they were lacking any key information. Having said that, as a researcher, I think there was additional information that I was interested in. So we do this a lot. One of the advantages we have in Massachusetts when you're talking about taxes for a ballot question like this is that the people have to be interested because they are going to have to vote on it. They could leave it blank, but they're going to show up on election day. They're going to vote. So, you know, whether it's a week before or a month before, they know they need to understand the question and take a position on the question. So there's an appetite for information about a tax policy issue, which you might not have if it were just folks in the State House voting on it. So I think just using a ballot question, kind of referendum like this, activates the interest of the people more generally, which can be helpful. It doesn't always activate the enthusiasm of the government, however, and so they were not, in this case, forthcoming with actual tax information. So one of the questions you really want to know for the millionaire's tax is how many people are going to pay, and how much money is it going to raise, and for that you'd need to know something about how much people earn in the state, and we were able to get decent proxy information, but our state government would not release really detailed information about that in a way that they should have, that would have helped the debate.
And why do you think it is so hard to get this information from the government?
So, I mean, there are legitimate privacy concerns about releasing this information, but you can address those without stymieing all requests. I think the bigger issues, one, the agencies that oversee it are understaffed, so it would take some work for them, and they don't really have free staff time to devote to every request that I make of them. But also, I don't think that there was a big push from their bosses higher up the chain of state government at the time to make that information available. And at the end of the day, the Department of Revenue that oversees these things, they work for the governor, they work for the administration. And so if it's a top priority of the administration to share this information, then it'll be shared. And if it is not, then it won't be. And in this case, it was not, and it wasn't.
The first argument I always hear when I talk with friends about higher taxes for millionaires is that they say, if you have those taxes, the millionaires just run away and they go somewhere else. But in your report, you say only a few people would leave. So how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, we're very fortunate to have existing research from other states. We are not the first state to introduce a surtax, an additional tax on very high earners. Sometimes with $1 million threshold, sometimes with other high thresholds. California, where you're located now, has additional taxes on very high earners. New Jersey does as well. So there are a couple of states who've done this. And some researchers have gone and looked at how many people left these states after these taxes were passed. So you can get a pretty good estimate of how many would leave here based on what happened in other states and the kind of distribution. The caveat there, obviously, is that one big reason people don't leave is that they don't have to. They can find other ways to avoid paying. Mm-hmm. So, you might leave if you think, well, if I don't want to pay this tax, I have to leave. I have got to move to another state. But if you have sophisticated accountants and tax attorneys who can give you other strategies for not paying this tax, then you can stay and not pay the tax and effectively have the same outcome. And I think that's a very real risk, and we're going to see a lot of that in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. So tax avoidance is the bigger problem.
Yes, by far the bigger problem. I mean, I'm trying to remember the exact kind of ratio, but I think it's sort of 5 times as big a problem, something like that. It's a much bigger problem.
And how many millionaires do you have here in Massachusetts?
It's about 0.6% of all households, so 20,000 households in a state of 2 or 3 million households. So not that many people. And you have to be careful how we're using the term millionaires, because you were making this sort of clear distinction between income and wealth and how you tax it. And I think growing up anyway, maybe I'm just old, but growing up, millionaire meant someone who had $1 million in wealth. You had houses and bank accounts worth $1 million. And what's being taxed here is people who have $1 million in income. You earn over $1 million in a single year. And there just aren't a lot of households earning that much. I should add, though, that those households earn a ton of money. So the way to think of it is only 0.6% of households earn over $1 million in a given year. But those households earn 20% of all the income in the state. Right? So it's 20,000 households. They earn 20% of all the dollars in the state. It's very concentrated, and you have some extremely high earners in that group. People who are earning not $1 million, but 10, 20, $50 million in a year.
And given these both effects, I mean, a few number of millionaires would actually leave and go to another states. The bigger problem is tax avoidance. But given both effects, how much money will the tax bring in at the end?
So we'll find out. We'll know for sure. But our estimate was it's kind of 2 parts. So let's assume that doesn't happen. Let's assume that nobody leaves and nobody changes their behavior. Then you'd expect the tax to raise about $2 billion a year, which is a lot of money. But then we do take account of those effects, and you lose about 30% of that money. So we estimate some $1.2, $1.3 billion net after you account for tax avoidance and people leaving the state. I should add, this is a very interesting week. I don't want to get in the way of your other questions, but this is a very interesting week to be talking about this, because there is another effect that we didn't model and that we should probably have thought more about, which is that there's a political kind of rubber band or backlash effect, where once this new tax on millionaires takes effect, there's a new political energy to cut other taxes on rich people because you've just done something bad for them. We just hit rich people with this millionaire's tax, and it's been a couple of months, and that's not great for rich people, so let's cut some of their other taxes. So we have a new governor, and she released her first budget proposal and tax plan this week, and it includes a big cut to the estate tax. The estate tax is an inheritance tax, right? It's a tax on the wealth of rich people. And part of the argument for why we should have a big cut to the estate tax is, well, we just raised the millionaire's tax, so we should now cut some of their taxes a little bit so they don't leave the state. And in some sense, this seesaw effect is part of the effect. Well, we taxed them here, let's help them out over here. And there's more energy for that than there would have been otherwise. So you also lose money to this weird political dynamic that generates new support for tax cuts for really wealthy people. Or at least that seems to be what's happening on the ground here.
Oh, that sounds a bit frustrating.
It's been really interesting to watch it play out, partly because the new governor is a Democrat, and I think advocates who have been thinking about how to tax the rich, have been thinking along the lines that you lay out, did not anticipate seeing this from seeing this kind of proposal from a Democratic governor. So yes, they're quite frustrated, confused, somewhere between frustrated and confused. The business community is happier about it. They've been pushing for this change explicitly on the argument that I laid out, that, well, we just passed this millionaire tax. We should really be worried about whether rich people leave and sap the competitiveness of our economy. So they're happy about it, but I find it a surprising development. Not least because, and this is not the topic here, but not least because these are different people. Like, okay, as I said, the people who will pay the millionaire tax, small group, very wealthy people, right? They earn $1 million in a year. The people who will pay large amounts in the estate tax, also a small group of people who earn lots of money, but not the same small groups of people, right? The people, well, to put it in the most glib terms I can, and then I'll say it in the less glib terms after, but in the most glib terms, the people who pay the estate tax are dead, right? You do not pay this tax until after your estate is going to be passed on. Now, you care about the tax before that, right? But you don't even really care about the tax until you're retired, for the most part, because that's when you're doing your estate planning and maybe you move out of state. The people paying the millionaire tax are much younger. Because they're at the peak of their earning powers, they're earning $1 million a year, right? It's not a wealth tax. So people at the highest levels of income are different than people at the highest levels of wealth. In particular, they tend to be younger, and they tend to be more productive, they tend to be running businesses and things. So it's easy to kind of assume that like all small groups of rich people are the same, but these are actually different small groups of rich people, and they're rich in different ways.
And would you say that these older generation, which owns more wealth, are they, in terms of political lobby power, more influential?
Both of these groups are very influential and powerful. And they're powerful through a lot of the same kind of mechanisms. They're powerful through the business lobby. They're powerful through tax policy experts who come out of the accounting world. So they have very similar kind of paths to lobbying influence, and they're very well connected too. Because the people who are older, who are starting to worry about the estate tax, they tend to be people who've been here a long time and were very successful, and so have built up connections over time that they can still use, and they tend to be the same kinds of connections they do circulate, I guess, and they do have connections that are similar, but they're different groups of people.
In Germany, there is I read a study which I found quite interesting, because they interviewed people from left-wing parties fighting for higher taxes. And they were very frustrated because in their own parties, they said it's a loser topic. So they had really problems to get it on the table in their own parties, because they think you cannot win elections with it. You can only lose elections. And these politicians also said that they feel overwhelmed by the complexity of these tax issues. So they said it's a loser topic for themselves in the party. And so I think they do not feel like being in their comfort zone. They like to talk about how to spend money, especially the social democrats. They like to talk a lot how to help the poor and how to help homeless people or whatever, but they don't feel comfortable to talk about taxes. Do you have the same problem here in the States?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's very difficult to craft winning messages around raising taxes. And it seems like it might not be, right? It seems like targeted taxes on the rich should be a message that resonates, but I think it tends to raise a couple of questions and concerns. One is it upsets your biggest donors, who tend to be very rich people, and politicians are very dependent on big donors. So that's always a problem. The other problem is lots of people think they're going to be rich, right? Like, I've seen various surveys on this. I remember one in particular, and I'm sure that's a little bit dated, but I remember seeing one that said basically 20% of people thought they were in the top 1%, and another 20% thought they would be. Mm-hmm. If you've got 40% of people who think they're going to pay a tax on the top 1%, that's a problem for a political message, right? Because it's really a very targeted tax, but lots and lots of people think they're going to be subject to it. So it does raise all kinds of challenges. Now, one of the solutions they found here is the one that you mentioned, which is let's not call it a tax, let's emphasize the spending side of it, right? It's a tax, but it's a dedicated tax. It is money that we're going to use for this thing. It's not money for politicians to spend on whatever they want or whatever their favorite thing is, or waste and fraud and whatever you worry about. It's money that's going to go to this particular thing. And that was really central to the victory of the Millionaire's Tax Coalition. Because similar ballot initiatives have been pushed every 5 to 10 years for a couple of decades, and they've always failed. And they tend to have failed in interesting ways. So you showed the polling data about how. Okay, so in almost all those cases, when they were making a push to raise taxes on wealthier people, early in the process, the polling showed overwhelming support, 70% support, 80% support. And then by election day, 40, and it went down. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Probably the biggest one is that the opposition mobilizes and spreads messages that, some of which are accurate and some of which are less accurate, but which are effective and really eats support. Whereas this time, what still happened, support fell from 70% or 75% to like 52%, but 52% is still enough to win, right? So they were able to just stay above that threshold, and tying the tax to a particular spending plan was probably, almost certainly, an essential piece for keeping it above water and making sure that it could pass in the end. Without that, I don't think it passes.
I agree that that really helped to convince people, and I thought, oh, that's a great idea for Germany. But then I realized we don't have any earmarked taxes at all. And the theory behind it is, I think, that only the government should decide on what to spend taxes. And I mean, to some degree, I can understand the argument, because if we imagine a world where all taxes were targeted to a specific kind of object or field, then there would no tax money be left for politicians to react on crises or whatever.
Yeah, there would be no flexibility left in the system.
So did that play any role in the discussion here?
You mean the concerns about flexibility?
Yeah.
So not really, because we're nowhere near the point where like every dollar of our tax system is spoken for. It's still a small percentage. And I think as long as there's some give in the system, you can always play games. Like, so the trick to this commitment to spend tax dollars on particular items is that it's kind of a lie. You say we have this millionaire's tax and all the money's going to go to education and transportation. And that's true in like an accounting sense. The dollars that come in from the tax forms that, will have to go to education. But that doesn't mean that the state's going to end up spending more money on education and transportation. Like, they could take other money that they would have put in education, and they'll just not spend that on education. They'll use the millionaire's tax dollars, but this other stuff they were going to put there, they'll spend that on whatever the heck they want. And so you actually don't reduce the flexibility. You just create this kind of accounting game. And this gets some people really upset, like it's a lie, it's not really targeted. And my own feeling is like, that's fine. It's fine. Like, we elect politicians to make decisions about how to spend money. Mm-hmm. This is new money for them to spend. We're still going to elect them. They're still going to make these decisions. But it is true that the idea that this money is targeted to these things is overstated at the least.
Okay, but that's interesting. So you say it's a lie, but it could help.
But it's fine. Yes, I think it's perfectly okay. If this is the story you have to tell, I mean, you call it a story. If this is the story you have to tell, that this money will go to these things, and it's the only way to do it, then I think there's a fine story to tell. But the honest response is, it's not really true, or it's not deeply true, or something. And we did some research on this as well. Like, how true is it? Because we're not the first state to do this. And the classic example in other states is the lottery. When states started introducing lottery systems, like in the 70s and 80s, a lot of times that money was supposed to be dedicated for a particular purpose, usually public schools. So you had this money coming in through the lottery system was going to go to public schools. So you can go back and look and say, well, like, how much of that money really did increase public school spending? And the answer is, some of it, but not all of it, even though, dollar for dollar did. but school spending would go up somewhere between 30 and 70 cents for every dollar. So, some of it ended up there, but not all of it, and nobody complains about it. That has mostly been fine.
In California, there was a similar proposition, the Proposition 30, and I think it was a tax for people with more than 2 million income, and it was targeted to fight climate change and the consequences of climate change. So a similar idea, but in California, it failed. So we have two similar propositions. One failed and one was successful. What do you think can we learn from it?
I think Massachusetts and California are in very different places in their path to taxing the rich. Maybe I should have said this first, but the state and local tax system in Massachusetts, that is the money that people pay, or the money that the state and cities collect in Massachusetts from all the taxes, like property tax, the income tax, the sales tax, it is not only is it not progressive, it is regressive, meaning that the richest people pay a smaller share than the poorest people, right? So we have a really strange, most states have this, they have a really strange tax system where it's not just like rich people don't pay much more than middle class people, they pay less as a percent of their income. And we haven't done much really in Massachusetts to change that. The millionaire's tax is the first, let's say, successful effort to really address this. In California, they've been doing this for a while. They've been raising tax rates on people over $1 million, over $2 million, over $5 million. So there have been a bunch of steps that California has taken to really raise their marginal tax rates on extremely high earning individuals. So, if voters then say, well, maybe not this one, but okay for the other four, that's a little different than in Massachusetts where it's like, all right, let's do one of these things. So I think in some ways it's just that, voters in Massachusetts are taking a first step, whereas voters in California have started have traveled a little bit down this path, and maybe they don't want to take every step forward, or maybe they're pausing, but they're in a very different place in terms of the structure of their tax on wealthier individuals.
I think there might be another reason, because in the beginning, when you looked at the polls, 55% were in favor of the Proposition 30. And then there were two kind of critics. The first critics were from the teacher union, and that was quite surprising to me. But they said, if the money goes to fighting climate change and its consequences, it can't go to schools and universities. So they were one of the opponents of this tax, and they spent $5 million to the No campaign. And that was interesting for me. And then there was another critique, and that had to do with the funding of the Pro campaign, because almost all money to the Yes campaign came from one company.
Uber, right?
And it was Lyft.
Lyft. I was close. I had a vague recollection of this, Lyft.
And I talked to one of the persons who initiated the whole proposition, and he told me we asked a lot of donors, but Lyft was the only one saying, yes, we will give you some money. So he said, without Lyft, there would have been no proposition. But then the opponents used it against the proposition, because there were this campaign like, there's only one company behind the whole proposition, and they will channel tax money into their own pockets. And there were TV commercials, and it was called the Lyft grift. And so in the end, I think people were confused. And if you are confused, you rather say no than yes. But what I found interesting also was that I think here in Massachusetts, the teacher union was one of the supporters of the Yes campaign.
Very much, yeah, very strongly.
So,
but you see, so I think you make an excellent point. I'm not going to disagree about the dynamics. The one thing I'll say is, you sort of can't avoid those kinds of dynamics either, right? It's not like there was no confusion or deliberate disinformation in the millionaire's tax campaign. We had a commercial here that was put out by the No folks, people who opposed it, and that money coming mostly from kind of large businesses, wealthy people. But it was a commercial featuring cranberry Bagger and like lower middle class families talking about how they were going to get hit, and small business people saying that they could never afford this tax. None of these people would ever be subject to the tax, right? But sowing this kind of confusion about who's really going to pay, who's on whose side, and giving the impression that people like people like the voters, are actually against it, and it's all kind of everything is being orchestrated at some higher level to manipulate you, can be a very effective strategy, and it is one we saw here as well. Obviously not as effectively as came out in the California case, but pretty effectively. I mean, it's one of the reasons that support for this dropped so precipitously, even if it didn't quite get below 50%.
So what would you say, why was the proposition successful in the end here in Massachusetts? What can we learn from it for other campaigns?
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, I'm not sure it was successful. So let's be clear, like, it was successful in that it passed. But, I mean, if it leads to estate tax cuts, if at the end of the day, if it doesn't actually raise that much new money, I think that would generate a whole new set of questions about how effective it really was, or how important it proves to be in the long term. And as I say, like, I think that's just more of an open question than I realized it would be. But in terms of like how it passed, there's a lot of sort of like right time, right movement, right place sort of issues. Massachusetts is a very liberal, progressive state in a, let's say, purplish country, and prides itself on this, and takes some pride in pursuing progressive opportunities where they arise, and this was one of those opportunities. It seemed to dovetail with a broader discourse that you were laying out about inequality and how to address it, so kind of right time. Also, coming out of the sort of pandemic era where you're seeing this kind of incredible growth in asset values, which has since come back to earth, but for a while there was this sense that like rich people have just gotten richer and richer as the rest of us are stuck at home or something. And so there's a kind of appetite for clawing back some money. Mm-hmm. And then just a really disciplined campaign. The supporters ran an extremely careful, deliberate, and disciplined campaign, from the commercials to their door knocking, like just start to finish. And it was pushed by a movement that has been kind of working together on progressive and union-focused issues for a long time. And they had a lot of time to build support and momentum. And the opponents just never mobilized, or never coalesced, I should say, in the same way. So, right movement, right time, right place.
And how did the millionaires react? Because in California, there were millionaires and billionaires, like the Netflix founder, and he gave, I think, $1.5 million to the No campaign. So were they involved in the campaign here?
For sure, yes. Some on both sides. There were...
on both sides?
Yeah, we do have like a coalition of progressive businessmen, mostly men, but business people in the state. And they do support causes like this, tax us more, they write those kinds of letters. So we do have a group like that. But
this is, by the way, pretty interesting, I think, because the normal vicious circle is that rich people get richer, they use the money to influence politics, to make sure they won't pay higher taxes in the future. And they are very influential. And now you have this very rich people, like the patriotic billionaires, saying, no, we want to be taxed. Tax us, please. Do you think that this can make a difference?
Yeah, I think it is very effective from a messaging perspective to get some of these people involved, because it does change the way people think about, is it a punishment, right? You want to get people out of the mindset of like, we're punishing rich people for their riches. That's just not a story or a message that works very well with voters who, not always, but at least harbor some, respect for people who have, built businesses and, generated their wealth. So So that kind of punitive angle is tough. But to say, no, we did all this and we're happy with the tax. We think this is appropriate. We were lucky at points. We benefited from our families. Whatever it is, it's reasonable to tax us. I do think that can be quite effective in changing how people approach it. But of course, there were also a very powerful group of wealthy people who opposed it. And I think they might have beaten it had they organized better and earlier. They saw the polling. They saw that it was polling 78%, and they sort of didn't believe that they could stop it. And there was a sense of kind of defeatism from the opponents. And so they never really tried to raise enough money. And then very late in the day, they kind of realized, actually, it's vulnerable. And if we get together, we could probably build an effective campaign against it. And they did, just very late, probably too late. And had they started earlier with more resources, I think you might have seen a different outcome. So there's a little bit of, I don't know if you call it luck there too, but maybe a miscalculation from the opponents.
We have talked about the different dimensions of inequality. So wealth inequality and income inequality. And wealth inequality is even higher. So now in Massachusetts, we tax the income more. But what about wealth? Do you think we also need wealth taxes?
Wealth taxes are really tricky. It's operationally very tricky, much more complicated than taxing income. So on the one hand, from like a justice perspective, yeah, it's hard to imagine achieving economic justice without some kind of equalizing force at the targeted at wealth. But it's a lot harder to design that, to effectively design that, than it is to effectively design the income taxes. And it's especially hard at the state level, because while we did find that like not that many people would leave the state if the income tax were raised by 4%, if there were a meaningful wealth tax, people would leave. Right? It's not that nobody leaves. It's that what is the change in incentive? A tax of this level for these people creates an incentive of this amount. This is the kind of calculation of it. And that's not that big. But to make a dent in the wealth tax, you would need something significant. To do something significant just for the state is a very vulnerable thing for a state to do, because it's very easy to move to New Hampshire, especially easy for people with high amounts of wealth. So I think to be tractable, it probably has to be a national program. And there, you still have some of the technical problems, but at least you avoid this kind of race to the bottom problem of like, well, one state tries to do it and has really detrimental impact on its ability to kind of maintain business leaders in the state or something.
So what do you think of Biden's proposal for a billionaire tax?
Again, being a researcher, it's easy to like get hung up on the operational stuff. I think taxing unrealized gains is tricky, super tricky, and not just for stocks, which you mentioned. The reason it's tricky for stocks is because, yeah, you could be up $500 million in a year, and so you owe $100 million, but the next year you're down, so you have losses. Like, what do you do with these losses? That, like, I just paid you $100 million, and now you owe me $100 million. I may never get that back. How do you do the losses on unrealized gains? That's really tricky. It's also really tricky. It's especially tricky for stuff that you can't mark to market easily. So, like paintings, you have valuable paintings. What's it worth? We're going to be fighting about this all day. So I think if you were to do it, it would have to come with just a totally revamped IRS. That is our tax oversight system would have to be totally revamped. So I worry about the operational stuff. But as I say, from a justice perspective, it's really hard to imagine how we get closer to something like real equity without addressing wealth disparities.
There's in New York a law professor, and he did a study, and I found it very interesting because he asked two questions. The first question was, what is really doable? And the second question was, how much money will it bring? So, an interesting perspective. And he said 3 approaches are promising. The first approach is to higher income taxes, so Massachusetts. The second approach are wealth taxes, but not annually, but in the case of death or gift, for the simple reason that you don't have to measure the wealth every year, which is very tricky and complicated. Then you have to do it only once in a lifetime. And the third approach he recommended were transfer taxes. So, for example, if you sell your villa for 10 million or 20 million, why not tax that? Do you think that this could be a good mix?
So, in the abstract, yes. But again, watching the state watching my state that just passed the millionaire's tax turn against the estate tax makes it hard to imagine a situation where we're going to go back to significant taxes, inheritance taxes of any kind. I mean, the United States has been on a path now for a couple of decades where the estate tax goes down and down and down, or the number of people it affects. It got branded as the death tax. It's been, ignominiously slandered for a long time and effectively. So it has really lost a lot of its bite. And I think kind of bringing that back is probably an important part of this, like reinvigorating the estate tax at a national level, more so than at a state level. The states can do some things, and Massachusetts, like a couple of progressive states, there are only like 10 or 15 states that even have state-level inheritance taxes of any kind, and they tend to be the states you would expect, the progressive states. But I think that the national one is the one that really matters and that could be reinvigorated. But the fact that no one's talking about it means the political opposition to it is still extremely strong, and the delicacy of taxing death. But even there, like, there are things that are obvious to me, and I think obvious to researchers, like the fact, I don't know how technically you want to get, but like the step-up basis problem for inheritance, which means if I inherit stock that, it doesn't matter, my grandfather dies and I get a stock from my grandfather and he bought it at $2 and it's worth $100, then I get it. I never have to pay the capital gains on those gains from $2 to $100. Nobody will ever pay the capital gains on those. Suddenly, we pretend that just because I inherited it, I bought it at $100. My gains start over. This is obscene, and it's just generally known to be obscene. But it's the kind of thing that can't get changed because, well, wealthy people are powerful and they have powerful lobbying interests, and so even that kind of thing that has been obvious to researchers and policy people for a long time can't happen or doesn't happen. Makes me sort of skeptical about how realizable even step 2 in this tripartite thing is, much less step 3.
Can you please say something optimistic?
I mean, the optimistic thing to say is we're on a very different trajectory than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? Coming out of the, Reagan, Thatcher, anti-tax era that, I grew up in, there really is a home for pro-tax politicians, and they are building a movement that is seeing, little seeds blossom now. So what seemed impossible 10 years ago is now happening, like the millionaire's tax. As I said, various versions of this have failed and they passed. So what seemed impossible to me, the hopeful thing to say is that 10 years from now seems much more possible, and the kinks have been worked out, and the politics are really quite different. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Maybe.